Good morning. I'm going to start off just by telling you a little bit about myself and my path to becoming a developer, because I wasn't always a developer. I've worked in pretty much every industry there is to work in, bar, I think, finance and catering. No, I did do catering. I've done pretty much everything. Not well, but some things I have done really well. The most recent job that I had before I went into developing was as a decorator and furniture restorer, furniture maker. And a lot of people think it's quite a big jump to go to developing, but actually there's a lot of crossovers with the way that you think about what people need and design it and then build it for them. And you get that feedback as well, and you might have user input to figure out what you're doing right and what you need to change. So after a while, I decided didn't really want to do that for the rest of my life. It was very physically demanding. And I'd always had an interest in developing, so I did a boot camp it's quite well known in England. It's called North Coders. They're based in Manchester. And from that, I then got my first job with a HR company in the tech department. And then I joined AO in January 2020, so just before the pandemic. It was still very new to everything. And I did a lot of my settling in and a lot of my learning with them basically remotely. So that was a really interesting experience, especially then when I co-founded the Accessibility Guild, and that was completely remote. We didn't have any in-person meetups. I left AO in February of this year, and then in June I joined X Design, and really luckily for me, there was already talk of an accessibility council there, so I joined the accessibility council right from the first day actually from before I joined X Design. I did a talk for Global Accessibility Awareness Day with them. So I was involved at a ground level. How I actually got into accessibility starts a lot longer ago than I wish it did. When I was first messing about with HTML in my teens, and I was doing what a lot of people did, building really small, strange little websites on AOL hometowns, and which has, I think, nearly been forgotten because it was completely wiped out in the mid-noughties. And MySpace, which a lot of people will be familiar with, and the different customization that you could do there. When I first started building those little sites on AOL hometowns, I didn't really know anything about developing. So I started off just with HTML, and because I was trying to find out how to do just basic things like make something appear on a page, I then found different forums and things that would talk about adding alt tags to make sure that screen readers could see what these images were, and properly structuring your HTML. So that was the basis of my knowledge for accessibility at that point. And then I completely went off track, went to university, did photography, was a photographer and ran a photography business in Liverpool for many years before I then jumped track again and went into construction. So I didn't really think about accessibility or developing for a very long period of time. And when I did North Coders, it was a very, very small part of the front end section of the course. It was, I think, an afternoon. That's the thing with boot camps, there's not a whole lot of time to actually get in deep with a lot of things. So where I really picked up a lot of my accessibility knowledge was when I got my first developer job at the HR company that I worked for. Basically, we had a client who had to be compliant by September 2019, I think it was, because there was going to be a change in the laws. And this was a very large, very well-known company. And basically, they needed to make sure that people who worked in their HR department were able to use the software that they had to basically do anything with HR. So report anything that somebody had come to them with a grievance or any issues at all. That software was totally inaccessible. And they had people who worked for them who had visual problems, maybe were neurodivergent, different things like that. So I was very junior. I was, I think, 5 months into being a developer. Hadn't really had any support at that point. So it was really just kind of trying to figure everything out. And this project had been through 6 developers, and all of those developers had been moved off onto higher priority things. So the clock was really ticking down on making sure that this major project for this major client was legally compliant. And it came to me as a junior, which was no pressure at all. It definitely didn't stress me out. So I had to very quickly upskill, and it was an immediate realization. This is not just adding alt tags. This is a very much different landscape to what I remembered from years and years earlier. So I did a lot of courses, a lot of research, learned how to test, use screen readers. It was very, very intense. And the thing that I had to go from, that I was given by the client, was an Excel spreadsheet for 4 pages of this HR app and the WCAG criteria broken down and where those pages failed. And having never seen the WCAG criteria before, that was an experience to see it in the worst Excel spreadsheet that you can possibly imagine. My favourite bit about that was that all videos had to have closed captioning. There was no video content anywhere on the site. So this comes back to this idea that, sometimes accessibility can be a checkbox kind of thing. They took the WCAG criteria and said, all of this needs to happen, whether or not it's relevant, whether or not it exists. We need you to make this work. So it was surprisingly difficult to convince them that bit was never going to work because they didn't have any videos. But such is dealing with finance sometimes. So I should never have had the lead on that, never mind being the sole person on it. I was far, far too junior. It did make me a better developer. I did learn a lot about semantic HTML, about what I should be doing, how I should be doing it right, what I needed to think about. But there should always have been somebody who was more experienced than me on that. Not necessarily from a point of view of developer experience, but accessibility experience, rather than trying to upskill and get this client's project to be completely compliant. Now, I did actually do it. I did write all of the documentation for testing and for developing accessibly going forward. And then basically I moved on because I knew that there wasn't really a community that was interested even in learning that. I had written the documentation and I knew this is never actually going to be read, which was very, very disappointing. But that's what happens sometimes when you're the only voice in the room. So I moved on to AO, and I thought, okay, the interviews went really well. Everybody's very interested in the accessibility. This is going to be great. But actually encountered a lot of the same barriers in prioritising accessibility as I had at my previous company. And some of those are lack of stakeholder buy-in, and regardless of whether it's accessibility or anything else, that's something that I think developers or anybody in a product team can encounter from time to time, where you just can't get across to a stakeholder why something is important, why you should be prioritising it over this other thing, which is maybe on the surface it looks like this is going to make us more money. This is the thing that we need to focus on. And especially when you're working for an e-commerce, everything comes back to we need to be profitable. So sometimes stakeholders will resist accessibility because they think it's going to block that progress to profitability. They think it's going to slow things down, it's going to cost more money. They don't understand how many people that it actually affects. And while I don't particularly like talking about Purple Pound, they don't realise how much money it could make them. So they think this is not something we should focus our time on. They can also have other misconceptions and think that it's only about screen readers. So if we can make this website work with screen readers, then that's great. Then our app is accessible, our website is accessible. They don't think about the fact that actually maybe the color contrast doesn't work for people who don't use screen readers but do have low visual acuity. They don't think about how perhaps there's a lot of jargon on the site and it's going to be difficult for somebody with a learning disability. And then there's also the issue of if you have no or low representation and diversity in a company, you've got nobody who can bring this to somebody's attention. So rightly or wrongly, we often think about things from our own experience, from our own lived experience, and we think about it from, well, that's never been a problem for me, so I don't think it's going to be a problem for anybody else. If everybody in the room is agreeing with that because it's never been a problem for them, then you're less likely to get people actually speaking up and saying, I think this is something we need to focus on. Ultimately, what all of those barriers comes down to is a lack of knowledge. If people don't know that they're missing this information, they don't know why they should focus on things, then they're not going to prioritize it. So a lot of the issues that I sort of touched on earlier on with boot camps is that they don't have time to go into those details. So with North Coders, for example, it was a great experience, but it was 14 weeks and it was back-end, front-end testing, everything that you can think of in those 14 weeks. And as I said, it was an afternoon to focus on accessibility within one of the front-end blocks. Really what we would kind of ideally want is that it's talked about very early on and it goes through the whole course. So even if it is back-end, maybe there's things about, well, okay, we need to think about how we structure our API so that we're sending information back in a way that is easily structured in the front end, because I've dealt with some very interesting API structures that have sent me some unique data, shall we say, that I've had to do some very creative things with. And if we thought about accessibility early on, about what is the easiest way that we can present this information, and if back-end developers understood a little bit more about what's kind of happening with accessibility in the front end, then that might go a long way to getting that information across. Many people as well don't realise how wide the field of accessibility it actually is, and it's so easy to get discouraged when you're trying to learn more. Certainly whenever I was first faced with that spreadsheet and I had to go and look to see what the criteria was, ironically it is notoriously inaccessible. It's very, very hard to read the WCAG criteria and have it make sense and for you to think, yes, this is understandable. It's understandable if you're from maybe a more technical background, or you are somebody who does have accessibility as something that you do day to day. But for somebody who's just coming into it, for maybe somebody who's very junior, it's just an assault of information. And so then you search, how do I do accessibility? And you'll have so many different things coming up that will tell you how to do it in different ways. Which way is best? You should have high contrast for colour, okay, but you can't have high contrast for certain neurodivergent conditions. Okay, I can't do both. Obviously, there's some kind of leeway with that. You could always have what you see on a lot of sites now where you have a dark mode toggle. You could do something similar where you can offer different kinds of colour contrast. But that is going to be a lot of work on people. And sometimes you do have to think about the balance. An accessibility council is a great way of getting that knowledge across. So at XDesign, we are starting with creating basically a library of resources to sort of narrow down that initial how do I get started question. We had a meeting, we discussed what are the main things that are barriers specific to us, to our company, what would we ideally like to see, and what is the best way to get there. And the resource library was the thing that came out on top. So that's the very first thing that we're doing. And it means as well that every resource that we add into that library is curated, so it will have been through a voting system or some sort of group, a working group perhaps, who's looked at the resource and said, this is something that our developers or designers or product owners, everyone can use. This is a good resource. So you're not going to have necessarily that thing where you're thinking, okay, this course, it takes 6 hours. That's not a huge amount of time, but I have no idea whether it's going to be 6 hours out of a training day where I get to the end and think, I don't know anything more than I did when I started. Knowledge was also the main reason that I started the guild at AO. It was sparked by a conversation that I had with another developer. We were building an internal app. It was a portal to display information related to campaigns that we were running on the site. And it was very early on. There was no designer on it, actually. I was the designer on it, and the developer and the tester. So basically, I put forward, we need to make sure that this is accessible at the beginning, because I knew that down the line, this was something that was going to be used by another team, perhaps multiple teams outside of our own. If we build it accessibly from the beginning, we prevent a lot of issues down the line when somebody new joins the business or somebody from another team has got an accessibility need. And we've thought about it as, we just need to get it out there quick. The developer was less convinced, largely because it was internal. And a lot of that was a misunderstanding about why it was better to add it in at the start. Because, like a lot of people who've worked in accessibility have heard, we can do it later. We can do it when it's not MVP. We can do it when we have more time. There's never enough time. By the time you've built the MVP, you've built it inaccessibly and you're going to have to go back and rebuild it. And you're going to save yourself a lot of trouble if you just build it accessibly at the start, rather than trying to go back into legacy code and shoehorn accessibility in there. I say that from experience. It is a painful process. You don't want to do it. So when I saw that there was that knowledge gap, and I knew we had a few other guilds already started, I went to my manager and I said, is there an accessibility guild? No, go ahead, start one. Okay, I wasn't volunteering, but I guess I am. So I actually worked with two other people within the company, Sarah, who's a senior front-end developer, and Steve, who's a lead QA. So that's a good basis to kind of start from. It wasn't just front-end developers, it wasn't just QAs, it was trying to get people across disciplines. And that makes all the difference, having all of that different knowledge, because we might not have had, as it happened, I did have the testing knowledge for a lot of the accessibility, but I may not have, Sarah may not have, we may have known how to write accessible code, but not necessarily how to test to make sure that we have written accessible code. So the first thing that we did was a very slightly controversial show and tell, where we ran through the homepage and said, here's everything that doesn't work, which turns out product teams don't like it when you say you built this thing and it doesn't actually work for accessibility. We did a screen reader demo as part of that, just to show what the experience was like for somebody who was trying to navigate through a website that didn't have, at the time, didn't have a skip link, had a mobile menu that wasn't fully hidden from screen readers, so the navigation menu would read everything twice. Because it appeared twice to the screen reader. We ran fortnightly drop-ins for people from different teams to say, hey, we're trying to build our app accessibly, we're trying to make this work, can you help us? Or just if they had a question about accessibility. We started a Teams channel, and we had Microsoft Streams so that we could put the recordings of any of our talks or demos or videos of any kind into that for people to refer to. The thing that we learned quite early on was that the drop-off in actual meetings was very quick, because unfortunately, the great thing about having a lot of other groups set up at the same time is that you have support for doing it, but you're also competing with a lot of other meetings. And people got what was referred to as guild fatigue, because there was a meeting every other week, or every week actually at one point. That was really hard to sustain, because there was a lot of demand as well, particularly within e-commerce when you come up to Black Friday and then you've got the lead up to Christmas. There are several times in the year where you're just completely overrun with everything needs to work, everything needs to scale up, everything needs to be done now. Your meetups are going to have to wait. So it wasn't necessarily the right environment for that kind of thing. But what did work really, really well was all of the asynchronous methods that we had. So anytime we recorded a video, we got quite a few people watching it and giving feedback in the Teams channel. The Teams channel was very, very active because people could just come across an article, post on LinkedIn, drop it in, and say, hey, I saw this thing. It took 2 minutes, they spread information, the engagement was pretty much throughout the day on those things, and it was a great way of engaging people who wished they could come to the meetings but just did not have the time. We also realised that it was a much wider issue than we initially thought. It wasn't just, we started out thinking, okay, we get the developers up to speed. Actually, it wasn't just a developer issue. And it's not even just a company-wide issue, it's an industry-wide issue. If we're not doing accessibility in different companies, it's probably because of a lack of knowledge across multiple roles. It's not just going to be, we've got a gap in the knowledge amongst developers. That will cause issues, but the thing that will cause more issues is if that chain of information stops at a certain point and doesn't go any further. So you might have a developer, and in fact, I had heard stories of somebody trying to start a similar guild a lot earlier than me at AO, and because there was no engagement with that person, not only did they not get to promote accessibility, they lost their passion for it, which is a very, very common thing when you're in accessibility because you sometimes feel like you're just shouting into the void. That's why it's really, really important to build a community around it. Get people on board so that you're not the only voice, so that when you do feel fatigued, there is somebody else who can pick up that burden and still advocate. And that's why sometimes product owners and BAs are in a really, really good position because they might be the direct line between the team and the stakeholder to say, this is an important thing, we need to make sure that we're doing it. Let's advocate, let's get this in front of people. The same as designers, they may not have all of the knowledge, but then somebody else might, even if they're not a designer themselves. Developers might know how to write code that is quick and that works, but isn't necessarily accessible. And not every QA is going to have all of the knowledge of different assistive technologies to test with. So it really does require a culture of collaboration to share that knowledge across roles. It is ultimately everybody's responsibility. It actually begins with recruitment and creating a positive, safe working environment where people feel like they can actually advocate for these things. So providing accommodations for interviews if people need longer to do a tech test or such, that's a great way to make sure that people know that they're going to join a company that actually cares about this. Mentioning it in a job ad, so that people think, okay, this is a company that, even if they don't necessarily have the knowledge or know what they're doing, then they're going to want to learn about it. But you have to make sure that work environment is in place before you start recruiting people in, because you can't just recruit people in to an environment and then say, fix our problems. It's a bit chicken and egg, you kind of have to start somewhere with it. But I think so long as you have that positivity of, yes, we want to make our work environment accessible and we want to make accessibility a priority for our products, then the recruitment kind of follows with that. It is directly linked to representation. You need to give people a chance to self-advocate. So it's great to have user research, user testing with people who have different needs, but you need to have people working in your team, working in your company who have those needs, because if you don't have somebody's lived experience, as I said before, it makes it a lot more difficult for people to have empathy. It's a sad reality that if people don't see somebody day to day who represent different backgrounds, different abilities, they're not as likely to take it on board. And there's countless examples of products that have made it the whole way through user research, user testing to the market, and they have not worked. So things like infrared soap dispensers and fitness trackers that were completely inaccurate or didn't work at all because they weren't tested on darker skin tones, because people from different backgrounds just were not represented. The team was homogenous. I would say user testing really, really does help. You will get great feedback, so long as you structure that testing and those questions properly. You need to make them clear. You need to tell people what you're actually looking for. There was a saying for a long time, nothing about us without us. So you don't want to start building things for people with disabilities and not actually involving them in it, because it's not going to end well. But that's now nothing without us, because, you know, disabled people are part of all of society. So it shouldn't just be a case of, we're building this product, we need to make sure it works for disabled people, so now we're going to invite them to get involved. You want all of those different voices about all of your products throughout the process, regardless of whether or not it is something that is specific to accessibility or whatever particular need. You want to have multiple voices so that you get different viewpoints and ideas. So an accessibility community's role is to provide support and resources, enable that collaboration, advocate when needed, because sometimes even when you have people who are represented in different areas, they might still need multiple voices to really push their needs forward. So you want to find a fine balance between talking over people and representing them. You don't want to talk over people. You want to make sure that you're actually representing them, but not instead of them actually talking for themselves. And it should absolutely work in tandem with appropriate user research and testing, and not replace in any way actually hiring people with different disabilities, different abilities, from different backgrounds. The main things that from my experience have worked for building an accessibility community have been, actually for X Design, meetups have worked really well for us, because we have a little bit more breathing space. We have a lot more people from a lot of different areas. So we might have a smaller group one week, but we'll have a large group the next week. It depends, because we're all on different projects, so it's a little easier to negotiate. So it might be that, depending on availability, meetups will actually work really well. Demos and knowledge transfer sessions are great. You can always record those and have them in a central location so that people can actually watch them back. An accessibility champions program is something that we see as our ultimate end game, where you would have an accessibility champion who's somebody with speciality knowledge in each team. And they don't have to be a developer, they can be somebody in UX, somebody who's a BA, but there would be one person in each team who could be an accessibility champion. That's something that companies like the BBC have had for quite a long time, and it's worked really, really well. Asynchronous works really well. So we've got a Slack channel in X Design that is, again, just as active as the Teams channel was when I was at AO. It just lets people have that place to have conversations and to be really open and to ask questions that maybe they would be a little bit reticent to ask in a meetup. And that library of resources that I mentioned, that's really key, so that people know where to find the information, and just having a central point. The accessibility community should be the central point, the first point of contact for people who want to know more. And then it's important to actually share that knowledge so that it doesn't just stay within the community. It goes to stakeholders, so that you can actually advocate for the things that the accessibility community has identified as important. And you can get stakeholders involved. Obviously, they're often time poor, but if you can get them involved, then it makes all the difference, because you're going to have somebody higher up who's ready to say, yes, we can do this, and I can sign off on that. And I mean, obviously, the more voices that you have who can advocate, the better, because they can raise that issue up. And be part of a wider accessibility community. So don't even keep it within the company. So I recently did a panel at Leeds Digital Festival, and there was 2 of us from X Design on that panel, but we also had 2 people from 2 other companies, one of which was actually a direct competitor with us, because this goes beyond commercial competition. This is going to benefit everybody, and it's a journey. So establish a baseline of what you can or can't do, There's never going to be everything accessible to everyone. There's always going to be something that you just can't make happen at the time or at all. If you can offer the information in a different way, if you can provide an alternative, that's great. But be upfront about the things that you can't actually change, and work on changing the things that you can. It's an ongoing thing. It's the goal is continuous improvement. It's not just, yeah, we've made it accessible, things are great, we're thrilled, we don't have to ever do it again. Accessibility is forever. Thank you for listening. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. We're also currently hiring across multiple roles at X Design, so if anything I've said has resonated and you're interested, please feel free to get in touch or check out our vacancies on the link.